There's a kind of grief that doesn't announce itself. It settles in the yard like a frost, quiet and patient, and by morning, everything it touched has changed. If you have ever inherited something you weren't sure how to carry, land, debt, a name, a promise made by someone who didn't survive long enough to help you keep it, drop in the comments below. I want to hear where you're from. In May of 1998, in Clarkson County, Kansas, a woman named Ruth Hollenbeck drove her husband's 1978 John Deere 4440 out of the machine shed for the first time since his funeral and sat in that cab alone with the diesel running and didn't move for 20 minutes. Dale Hollenbeck had farmed that tractor for 20 years. The seat still held the shape of him in the vinyl. There was a coffee ring on the console he had made in 1991 and never bothered to clean. He never saw it as a problem worth solving. Ruth already knew there was $243,000 in operating debt on the farm. She already knew the note renewal was due at First State Bank of Hardin on September 15th. She already knew Dale's brother Gary had been calling. What she didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was what she was going to do about any of it. Most of Clarkson County thought they had that figured out for her. They were wrong. Clarkson County, Kansas sits in the south-central part of the state in a stretch of country that is mostly sky and mostly flat with just enough roll to fool you. The roads run section line straight. The grain elevators in Hardin, the county seat, are the tallest things for 20 miles in any direction. In May, those elevators are full of winter wheat waiting to move, and the smell of it hangs over town on a warm day like something old and wholesome and almost like bread. Dale Hollenbeck had been born on that farm in 1949. His father Earl had bought the original 320 acres in 1941, and Dale had farmed it his whole life from the time he could sit in a tractor cab, adding parcels as they came available until the operation reached 560 acres in the late 1970s. Dryland wheat and grain sorghum, milo, in the local word for it. No irrigation. No livestock since the early 1990s, when Dale had sold the last of the Angus cows his father had kept. The farm could run without cattle. What it needed was rain and patience, and Dale had both. Ruth had grown up in Rice County, 60 miles northwest. Her maiden name was Graber. She had 1 year at Hutchinson Community College studying bookkeeping before she met Dale at a rural electric co-op meeting her father dragged her to in the spring of 1973. She was 22. Dale was 24. He wasn't a talking man in social settings, but he was steady and deliberate, and she noticed the way he shook her father's hand, solid, looking him in the eye, and decided something about that before the meeting was even over. They married in October of that same year at First Methodist Church in Hardin. 2 children followed. A daughter, Lynn, who was 23 in 1998 and working for an insurance agency in Wichita. A son, Todd, enrolled at Kansas State in engineering. Neither was farming yet. Neither had planned to be. Dale ran the operation nearly alone, with a part-time hired man during planting and harvest, a neighbor's son named Rodney Birch, who was reliable with equipment and short on words in the way Dale appreciated. The rest of the year, it was just Dale. He worked quietly and methodically, the way men do when they've been doing the same work long enough that the steps have become invisible to them, just motion in a familiar direction. He died on a Wednesday morning, May 6, 1998. He was drilling soybeans in the south field on the 4440 when a stroke hit. Rodney found him at noon when he came out of trade-off. The paramedics said it was massive and quick. He was 48 years old. Ruth was in the house when Rodney came to the door. She knew from his face before he reached the step. After the funeral, after the family drove home and the casseroles ran out, Ruth sat down at the kitchen table and opened the farm files. Dale kept his records in a 3-ring binder he updated every January. She had known they were there. She had never needed to open them before. Operating loan balance, $243,000. Annual interest rate, 8.75%. Note renewal date, September 15th, 199. 8. She counted the days from May 12th, the morning she opened that binder, to September 15th, 120 SI. X. For months. The clock was already running. G. She put the binder down and looked out the kitchen window at the machine she. D. Through the open door, she could see the 4440 parked where Dale always parked it. The grain wagons lined up beside it. The dark shape of the 1984 John Deere 7721 combine under the lean-to on the east side. E. She thought about something her father used to say. Numbers are just decisions waiting to be made. E. Then she made herself a cup of coffee. E. Sat back down. Opened the binder a guy. N. The operating loan at First State Bank of Hardin had been on the books since 1988. The year Dale took on a final parcel of 40 acres from a neighbor who retired from farming after a bad run and borrowed to cover the purchase plus the extra seed and chemical costs of bringing that ground into production. Over time, across a decade of fluctuating wheat prices and 2 dry years in the mid-1990s, the note had grown in the way farm debt grows when every decent year gets spent on the next year's inputs. Dale had never missed an interest payment. He had never missed the September renewal, but the principal had stayed stubbornly large. He had been meaning to make a real dent in it once the kids finished school. That plan had simply run out of time before he did. The loan officer at First State was a man named Delbert Cross. He had been at that bank 22 years. He was 61, wore a string tie and short-sleeved dress shirts regardless of weather, and spoke in the careful, measured way of a man who had delivered a large number of difficult messages over 2 decades and had learned to make them sound reasonable. He called the 3rd week of May. He was sorry for her loss. Dale had been a good customer and a man of his word. He didn't want to create unnecessary pressure during a difficult time. Then, Ruth, I do need you to come in sometime soon and talk about the September renewal. I want to understand what the situation looks like going forward. She told him she would come the following Tuesday. After she hung up, she wrote Delbert Cross, Tuesday, 10 a.m. on the notepad by the phone and underlined it twice. Gary Hollenbeck called 4 days later. Dale's older brother was 52, farmed 320 acres south of town, and had always carried a complicated relationship with the land their father had left behind. Earl Hollenbeck had left his 360 acres to Dale expressly when he passed in 1979, with the understanding, laid out plainly in the will, that Gary had already received money and equipment in prior years to establish his own operation. That had been a settled question for nearly 2 decades, as far as the legal record was concerned. Whether it was settled in Gary's heart was a different matter. His call to Ruth was careful. He was worried about her. Farming 560 acres alone as a widow was a hard thing. The north 280 acres, the lighter ground, the parcels Dale had added through the years, was probably more than she needed to hold on to right now. I could take that north piece off your hand, Ruth. Help you get out from under some of this. $420 an acre, cash. Clean title. You'd have over $100,000 to work with. County market value for dryland ground in Clarkson County in 1998 ran between $620 and $680 an acre. $420 was not a favor. Ruth thanked him for calling. She said she was still working through the numbers. She would get back to him. She did not get back to him. Gary called again 3 weeks later. This time the offer was the same, but the language had shifted slightly. I'm trying to help you. Then, you don't want to lose the whole farm trying to save part of it. And finally, Dale would have one of you taken care of. She let him finish. I'll let you know, Gary, she said. The only person she mentioned the call to was Lynn, who came home for a weekend in June. Lynn's response was short and clear. "Mom, $420 is not what that ground is worth." Ruth said, "I know." What Ruth did not say to Lynn, what she had not said to anyone, was the conversation Dale had with her the winter before he died. January of 1998. Snow on the ground. A slow, cold weeknight with the wind pushing against the north side of the house. Dale had been going through the farm files the way he did every January, and without looking up from his papers, he had said, "If something ever happens to me, don't sell the north ground to Gary." She had asked him why he said that. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because he'll offer you a price that isn't fair, and he'll do it while you're still grieving. And he'll believe he's helping you." She had looked across the table at him. "What makes you say that?" Dale set down his pencil. "Because that's what he did to Harold Fenner's wife in 1991. Elaine, after Harold died, bought her North 80 for $60 under market. She didn't find out until 2 years later when she sold the house and the realtor pulled the comps." Ruth had remembered that. She had not connected Gary to it until that moment. "He's not a cruel man," Dale said. "He just looks at a piece of ground like something that should have been his to begin with. He can't help it. That's who he is." He had gone back to his files after that. He had not brought it up again. Ruth had filed it away the way she filed away things she hoped she would never need. Standing in the machine shed in June of 1998, she felt that January conversation settle into her with a different weight than it had carried before. Dale had known. He had seen it clearly enough to name it, and he had told her, and then he had gone out and died in a soybean field before either of them thought to write the thing down. What he had left her was a memory, a shed full of old equipment, a note with 4 months on the clock, and one exact instruction about what not to do. She wrote it in the front cover of the loan file, in her own handwriting, with a pen she'd had for years. "Don't sell the north ground to Gary." She did not write a reason. She did not need one. Ruth was not a public woman about her faith. She went to First Methodist in Hardin every Sunday unless the roads were bad, served on the altar committee, brought food for the bereavement dinners, and had taught Sunday school for 3 years in the late 1980s before her whole class aged up to the youth group. She prayed privately, the way her mother had taught her, not as a performance and not as a bargain, but as a kind of naming, a way of saying, "Here is exactly where I am. I know you can see it. I'm setting it down for a minute." 3 weeks after the funeral, she went into the machine shed to check the 4440 service records. She needed to know when it had last been serviced, whether the hydraulics had recent issues, whether the injectors have been cleaned. Basic questions, practical ones. The service binder was on the shelf. Dale always kept it between a spare fuel filter and a grease gun. She pulled it and opened it. All Dale's handwriting. Dates, engine hours, part numbers, notes in the margins. A man's whole working relationship with a machine, written down in columns going back 18 years. Behind a service binder, on the same shelf, was a New Testament, King James, worn through at the spine. She had known it was there, had seen it on that shelf before, but had never pulled it down. She pulled it down. It fell open to Proverbs 22, not because of a bookmark, because that was where the spine had split from being open there often enough. I went to verse 7 without looking for it. "The rich ruleth over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender." She stood in the machine shed with the New Testament in one hand and the service binder in the other, and the 4440 behind her in the half-light. All she said was, "All right," not exactly out loud, just enough to feel it move in her chest. She put the Testament back on the shelf. She took the service binder to the kitchen table and did what she had come out to do. Several weeks later, she sat up until 2 in the morning with the loan papers spread across that same table. The numbers were doing what numbers do when you are tired and afraid. They stopped being numbers and became consequences. She sat there long enough to feel the fear entirely. Then she set the papers down and said Dale's name once. Just his name. Then she went to bed. That was the whole prayer. It was enough. The Tuesday meeting at First State Bank lasted 45 minutes. Delbert Cross had a single-page summary prepared. Outstanding balance, $243,000. Current annual interest at 8.75%, $21,262. The September 15th renewal would require documentation of a viable repayment plan, or the bank would need to begin the process of evaluating its collateral position. He did not use the word foreclosure. He did not need to. He was polite. He offered her coffee. Ruth had come with a folder. Inside was a yellow legal pad with a plan she had written out the previous week in neat columns. She slid it across the desk without speaking. The plan had 3 parts. First, she would lease 400 acres to 2 neighboring operations. 200 acres to the Tillman brothers north of her, who had been asking about expansion ground for 3 years. Another 200 to a young operator named Craig Esterhouse, who had been renting ground on the east side of the county for 2 seasons and was ready for more. Her price was $85 per acre, the lower edge of county average. Combined, $34,000 annually. Second, she would keep 160 acres, the home quarter plus the South 40, and farm it herself on the 4440. Winter wheat going in that fall. She would hire Craig Esterhouse's crew for custom harvest at $8 per acre. She budgeted $1,280 for the cut. Third, she would take a part-time bookkeeping position at Hardin Grain, which Phil Dreesen, the elevator manager, had offered her without being asked. He had known Dale since 1980 and was not a man who made gestures. 30 hours a week, $9.50 an hour, roughly $14,820 a year. Combined annual income projection, approximately $48,820 before taxes and farm expenses. Annual interest payment, $21,262. Working margin for living costs and a modest principal reduction, roughly $27,500. Delbert Cross read through the plan without speaking. Then he read it again. He took his glasses off. "Ruth," he said, "you'd be making interest-only payments for the first year or 2. Yes. The note won't shrink quickly. No, but won't grow either, and the farm stays whole. This depends on the wheat crop coming in. It does. And both leases holding. I have signed letters of intent from both parties." She placed them on the desk. She had typed them herself on Dale's old typewriter and had both men sign them at her kitchen table. Delbert Cross looked at the letters. He looked at Ruth. He was quiet in the way of a man running a calculation that is only partly about dollars. "The board meets the last Friday of the month," he said. "I'll present this and recommend a 12-month interest-only arrangement. After that, we need to see principal reduction." She told him that was acceptable. She drove home and went to the machine shed and sat on the step below the 4440's cab for a while. She was not celebrating. She was steadying herself for what came next. She had 4 days before Gary was supposed to call again. In the 3rd week of July, Ruth sold the combine. It was the decision she had sat with longest. The 1984 John Deere 7721 was not new equipment, but it was solid and well-maintained, and she had the service records to prove it. A dealer in Pratt offered her $14,500. She took it. She put $12,000 directly onto the note principal before the September renewal. She kept $2,500 in a separate account she labeled in Dale's handwriting, reserve, because that was what he had always called it, and she saw no reason to change the word. Word traveled quickly in Clarkson County, as it does in communities where everyone watches what moves across everyone else's property without appearing to watch. A woman alone, selling her husband's combine, leasing most of his ground to 2 neighbors, going to work at the grain elevator. By August, it had become a story. Gary Hollenbeck heard about the combine the same week it left the lot and called Ruth that evening. "I heard you sold the 7721. "I did." "Where are you going to harvest from?" "Custom. Esther House crew." A silence. Then, "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Ruth, I think you should reconsider my offer. I'm not trying to take advantage. I'm trying to keep this family from losing everything Dale spent his life building." There was a genuine version of that concern somewhere inside Gary Hollenbeck, and Ruth knew it. That was what made the conversation hard. He was not entirely wrong that it was a risk. He was not entirely wrong that farming alone was a difficult thing. What he was wrong about was the price. And what he was wrong about was the assumption that the risk was worse than the alternative. "Gary," she said, "I'm not selling the north ground." A pause. "I have the bank's approval on a 12-month interest-only renewal," she continued. "Both lease agreements are signed. The wheat goes in the ground next month. I start Hardin grain on Monday. I've thought this through. What if the wheat doesn't come in? Then I'll deal with that." "Ruth, that's not a plan." "It's more of a plan than you're giving me credit for." Gary was silent long enough that she wondered if he'd hung up. Then, "All right, Ruth, but my offer stands." She thanked him. She hung up. The next day, she drove to the south field in the 4440 with a thermos of coffee and a tire pressure gauge and did what Dale always did the morning before planting wheat. Walked the headlands slowly, checking the soil, feeling the ground through the soles of her boots. It was mid-August. The soil was dry but workable. The field had a particular quality in that light, the kind of late summer flatness that turns gold in Kansas. And standing there with a thermos war in her hand, she felt something she didn't have an exact name for. Not hope, not quite. More like a door she had decided to walk through, even though she couldn't see what was on the other side yet. She climbed back in the 4440 and got to work. The county watched with the quiet, specific skepticism of people who believe they already know how something ends. A few of the men at the co-op, Gary among them on some days, spoke about it with a careful sympathy that was not really sympathy, just prediction wearing manners. The smart money said Ruth Hollenbeck would be making concessions to the bank by spring. She put in her wheat. She drove to Hardin grain every weekday. She made the October interest payment on time. The smart money was wrong. The years between 1998 and 2005 did not move in a straight line because they never do on a farm and they never do in a life. The first wheat harvest came in June of 1999 at 43 bushels per acre. Not exceptional, not poor. On 160 acres at $3.10 a bushel. That was $21,328 gross at the elevator. After Esther House's custom harvest fee, seed cost, crop insurance, and fertilizer, she cleared just under $11,000 from her farmed acres. Combined with lease income and Hardin grain wages, she finished the year $4,200 ahead of projection. She paid it directly against the note principal. Delbert Cross's office mailed the updated balance the following week, $238,900. She taped that statement to the inside cover of Dale's service binder and put it back on the shelf between the fuel filter and the New Testament. In 2000, the weather turned. Clarkson County ran 12 inches below normal rainfall from March through June. The kind of dry spring that cracks the ground by May and stresses winter wheat in its heading stage. Ruth's 160 acres yielded 29 bushels. Net from the farm ground after expenses, $2,100. The leased acres cushioned the year. $34,000 in lease checks arrived on schedule, indifferent to the drought. She made interest and a small principal payment. The note moved to $233,400. Slow, but moving. The Tillman brothers renewed their lease without discussion. Craig Esterhaus renewed his and asked if she had any more ground available for the following year. She told him not yet, but she'd keep him in mind. That same year, Gary Hollenbeck bought a new John Deere 8410 tractor. Not leased, purchased, $178,000. He also enrolled in a program through his irrigation district to expand his irrigated corn acres from 80 to 200, which required an additional $45,000 in infrastructure financing. Ruth heard about the 8410 through Rodney Birch, who heard it at the elevator. She did not comment on it to anyone. In 2001, the wheat was average. She made interest and modest principal. In 2002, the crop was good, 51 bushels per acre on her own ground. She paid down $18,000 against the note in 1 year. The balance fell to $211,000. For the first time, the number felt like something she was winning against rather than something winning against her. She bought a chest freezer that fall and filled it. It seemed like the right kind of declaration. In 2003, Lynn called from Wichita and asked how things stood. Ruth told her, balance at $198,000, lease is still solid, the $4,440 needed injectors that winter, but nothing serious. She had also bought a used 1992 John Deere 9500 combine that fall, $31,000. Purchased outright from a retiring neighbor, no note, because her land base had grown enough through one small lease expansion that custom harvest was no longer the most cost-effective path. Lynn asked, "Are you okay, Mom?" Really? Ruth thought about the question. She looked through the kitchen window at the machine shed. "I'm working," she said. "I'm all right." And she was. Not in a way that meant the grief had left, or that the house wasn't too quiet in the evenings, or that she didn't sometimes set 2 cups out of habit before remembering. But she was 42 years into understanding that a life is mostly the accumulation of decisions made on difficult mornings, and she had been making good ones. Note balance at the end of 2003, $189,000. In 2004, corn prices collapsed across the upper Midwest. The USDA had projected strong demand. The market moved the other direction. Irrigated corn operations in south-central Kansas, the ones that had borrowed to expand in 2000 and 2001, were particularly exposed. High input costs, depressed prices, and a dry summer that pushed well water levels lower than the irrigation district had publicly projected. Gary Hollenbeck ended 2004 with his worst financial year since he had started farming his own ground. The 8410 note was current, but barely. The irrigation infrastructure loan had gone 90 days past due. Ruth heard about this in January of 2005 from Rodney Birch, who had it from his brother-in-law at the Pratt County FSA office. She did not call Gary. She set the information aside and kept working. In March of 2005, she received a registered letter from Delbert Cross's office. Inside was a formal account commendation notice and, clipped to it, a personal note on First State letterhead. "Ruth, I want you to know I will be retiring at the end of April. Before I go, I want to say that the plan you brought to this office in the summer of 1998 was one of the most carefully prepared first-year proposals I ever reviewed from a single operator. I should have told you that at the time. I didn't. I wish I had. D. Cross." She read it twice. She folded it and placed it in the service binder behind the balance statements. In April of 2005, Gary Hollenbeck listed 160 acres of his home ground for sale. His attorney had advised him he had no better option. Listed price, $590 an acre. County market had moved to $660 by then. Ruth called his listing agent. She said she was interested in 80 of the 160, specifically the parcel that abutted the southeast corner of her ground. She offered the listed price. The agent called back the next morning. Gary had accepted. She mentioned it to no one that week. She signed the papers at a title company in Hardin on a Thursday afternoon. She drove home and went to the machine shed and sat on the step below the 4440 for a long time. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired and grateful and quiet. She thought about Elaine Fenner, who had found out 2 years later when the realtor pulled the comps. She thought about Dale in January of 1998 with his pencil and his files and his steady voice. Don't sell the North ground to Gary. She thought, I didn't, Dale. I didn't. Gary did not call her. She did not call Gary. They saw each other that August at a niece's graduation party in Pratt. He stood across the yard with a paper plate. They made eye contact once. He gave a small nod. She gave one back. That was the whole conversation. It was enough. The final payment on the first state operating note cleared on May 14, 2005, 7 years and 3 months after Dale died in the South Field on a Wednesday morning in the spring. The account balance went to zero. Ruth drove to the bank and asked to close it formally. The teller was a young woman named Amber who double-checked the balance, printed the closure form, and said, "You're all clear, Mrs. Hollenbeck." Ruth signed. She folded her copy and put it in her purse. On her way out, she passed Elbert Cross's old office. A different name was on the door now. A younger man she had spoken to once on the phone. She didn't stop. In the truck in the First State parking lot, she sat for a moment with the engine off. Hardin did what it always did on a Tuesday in May. Moved around her at its modest pace. The grain elevator visible from the parking lot. The co-op sign across the street. First Methodist 2 blocks south with its reader board. What worry takes from you, faith cannot replace. Only God can. She read the sign. She didn't write it down. She drove home. The 80 acres from Gary's listing came into the farm as a natural extension of her southeast corner. She planted winter wheat on 60 of it in September of 2005 and left 20 acres in cover crop through the first winter to let the soil settle after years of irrigated corn rotation. The first wheat that new field produced in June of 2006 yielded 47 bushels per acre. She drove her 9,500 combined through it on a Thursday morning in early June with the Kansas sky the way it gets in harvest. High and blue and enormous and indifferent in the best possible way. The dust came up behind the header. The diesel ran steady. The tank filled. She thought about Dale the way you think about someone who should be there, but isn't, not with sharp pain anymore, but with the specific ache of a good thing held at a distance he didn't choose. She finished the field by noon. She shut down the combine, climbed down, and stood there for a minute looking back at what she had cut. Then she drove to the elevator and dropped off the first load. Here is what the 7 years between 1998 and 2005 had cost. Dale, who never saw any of it. A relationship with Gary that had once been something awkward, complicated, genuine in its way, and was now quieter. Something that lived in parking lots and family gatherings, and one not across a yard, and was neither repaired nor destroyed, but simply changed in a direction neither of them chose. The years when the children were busy building their own lives, and she was alone in that farmhouse in ways that don't announce themselves, but settle in like a frost. The evenings, the 2 cups, the habit of turning to say something before you remember. Ruth did not want credit. She was not interested in being a lesson or a cautionary tale or a story someone told at the co-op. She had done what her husband told her to do, and what the numbers told her to do, and what the planting schedule told her to do, and what her own stubborn belief in the worth of the land told her to do. That was all, and all of that together was the whole thing. Ruth Hollenbeck is in her mid-70s now. Her son Todd took over most of the day-to-day operation in 2018. Her daughter Lynn retired to a place near Hutchinson, her mother's home country, back in Rice County, where the elevators and the road signs and the smell of the grain in May are all familiar in the way of places you left when you were young and find have not changed as much as you have. The 4440 is still in the machine shed. It runs every year. Todd uses it the way Dale used it, steady, methodical, for the jobs that don't require anything more than an engine and a transmission and a pair of good hydraulics. Dale's New Testament is still on the shelf between the spare fuel filter and the grease gun. Open to Proverbs 22. The spine cracked where it always was. Ruth still brings food for the bereavement dinners at First Methodist. Still serves on the altar committee. Still walks her fields in mid-August before drilling wheat, feeling the ground through the soles of her boots the way Dale taught her, the way she now does without thinking. Every May, on the anniversary of his death, she drives to the county cemetery east of Hardin and tells Dale how the planting is going. She tells him about the grandchildren, about the price of wheat, about whether the equipment has been giving trouble. She has never told him about the note balance at zero, or about the 80 acres, or what Gary Hollenbeck's asking price turned out to be. He had known enough of it in life. It wasn't a story she needed to retell to the man who had started it. But sometimes she stands as headstone longer than she means to, and she thinks about a Wednesday morning in May of 1998 and a kitchen table covered in loan papers, and a New Testament with a cracked spine on a machine shed shelf, and a 4440 with a seat that still held the shape of someone who had not survived the spring. And then she gets in her truck and drives home. The fields are already green by then. She has work to do. There is a question I want to leave with you. Ruth Hollenbeck was not a financial expert. She was not a prodigy. She was a woman who had grown up around numbers and land, and had married a man who taught her to read a field the way some people read a room. What she had, more than anything, was a single January conversation she never forgot, words said quietly at a kitchen table by a man who did not know they were one of the last useful things he would ever say. I keep thinking about how many farms might have been saved not by strategy or miracle or luck, but by one sentence said at the right time to the right person that somehow outlived the one who said it. If you have ever had to protect something you were told to protect, land, a name, a promise, a choice someone you loved made before they were gone, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you're from, or tell me about the person who left you with words that carried further than they knew. I read every one. If this story reached you, share it with someone who grew up on land that mattered to a family. Subscribe if you haven't yet. The next story is already coming.